I can clearly see a pathway for addressing climate change at scale around the world. It's just a matter of money, right? And if that's the problem, that's easily solvable, right? It's when you have these really complicated, technologically difficult systems, that is a whole nother deal, right? And I think some of the space race stuff is that. Or fusion, for example, right? There are real technologically difficult problems to solve there.
Welcome to the Innovation Blueprint, the podcast where we explore the latest in business, technology, and industry transformation. I'm Haresh Singhani, and in each episode, we dive into the strategies, challenges, and innovations reshaping our industries. Join thought leaders and experts as they discuss how innovation and technology, from AI to sustainability, drive growth and change. Morning, Andy.
Good morning.
Here we are, excited to have this conversation. I know you've been up to some exciting things lately. We've talked a number of times, so I already have some idea about what you're doing, but I'd love to get our listeners, give them an opportunity to learn about, Andy and what he's up to, where he got started in life, professionally, etc. So let's have you start, please.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. This is kind of a great opportunity. I know we've been talking for a while. My background is I'm a third generation Pepsi bottler turned waste to energy entrepreneur. Basically, I fell into this environment. It was pretty random. I was making a presentation at a conference in Half Moon Bay, and I grabbed the attention of an oil executive. He asked to sit down to have breakfast with me, and I decided to take the opportunity to make fun of him. And I said, why don't you recycle plastic? Because Pepsi and Coke can't buy enough recycled plastic. And that conversation kind of spurred me onto this path of realizing that I knew where giant piles of trash are, and I knew how to convert them into value. And so right now, what my company Godot does is we're focusing on waste producers of 50 tons or more a day and converting those waste streams into things like hydrogen, food grade CO2, and carbon credits. It's a pretty wild pathway that got me here, but I guess it's part of my perpetual curiosity and love of just learning new things that made me start to put these pieces together and realize, I can do this. And that's how I got here. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, it's a great story from what I understand. And I, again, love to have our listeners and viewers understand more about it. I had a couple of questions. One is your name, the company name.
Yes.
Right? It's an interesting name you picked, and I'm curious how you chose it.
There's a play called Waiting for Godot, and it's basically two people are talking, and they're trying to solve a problem by waiting for somebody else to come in and do it for them. But at the end of the day, Godot doesn't arrive. The moral of the story is if they just collaborated, they could get it done. And instead of just complaining, they can do the action. And so I see Godot as being kind of the solution to addressing climate change at scale by working together and connecting different pieces of the supply chain that right now are not talking, right? It's the end of one supply chain is the beginning of another. And so that's really where I came up with the name. And I also love it. My dog's named after it. So I like to play a lot.
There you go. Wow. The idea here is that the world, or we are creating, or you are creating Godot instead of waiting for Godot, right?
Exactly.
That's interesting. One of the other things I was curious about, a lot of the younger, so I have a Gen Z, I believe she's a Gen Z in my family. So our only kid, she's about to turn 23 in a month or so. As she was kind of going through the school system, she finished her college in 2024. There were a lot of kids that were concerned about climate, like a huge percentage. You're talking about like, it felt like 1 out of every 2 kids were like doing extracurricular activities during middle school, high school, even college to look at climate. And you kind of came at it from a slightly different journey, right? You were like looking at all these Pepsi supply chain, and you're like, everything's going from the plant to wherever, but then the trucks are coming back empty. I'm just curious, what was the spark or inception? And were you thinking about climate change like as a kid, or was that something that came about gradually?
it didn't start out as climate change for me. It really started out as what are the externalities of the beverage distribution industry, right? As I grow up, our industry went from glass bottles that were a two-way street. You would deliver a glass bottle, you drink your Pepsi, put it back, and you get a return and you get a deposit, right?
Yep, yep. The old system.
The old system was a circular path. Then we went to cans, and cans were almost like a 1.5 because instead of having that deposit directly with the store or anything like that, it was recycled.
Yep.
And right now, it's like 70% of all of the aluminum ever smelted is back in circulation. It's actually a very circular. And then we got to plastic, and that was a one-way street, and it was everybody else's liability. So when I grew up, I was in the everybody else's liability, but I could also see that this was going to be a problem. But I also saw other issues. There were things associated with public health, like what our ingredients were. Being in the beverage industry, you're actually, in many cases, at the forefront of a lot of these battles, both in public health as well as in climate change. So my approach has always been of like, how do I address these things that I see could be, almost in a self-serving way, damaging to the industry that has kind of given me all these opportunities and privilege.
Sure.
That just has put me in positions to look at sustainability in so many different ways.
I see. I see.
It just like naturally got me there, let's say.
If it's accurate to summarize that, you were just thinking about the business model of the family.
Yeah.
And then you saw some externalities that you're like, okay, these aspects are not going to continue to scale, right?
Yeah.
Like plastic usage or trucks coming back empty, whatever those pieces are, right? One of the things you were seeing was there was a lot of waste being generated in general, right, in the world. And so you're putting all these pieces together in your mind. Whereas many people see climate change or environment almost as an altruistic act, right? But it sounds like in your case, it was very practical. You're just seeing X, Y, Z, and you're like, okay, there are these pieces that need to be further optimized. Some things are not scalable. They need to be made scalable.
Yeah, and I think it's also because I was exposed from a political side, right? Being a member of the American Beverage Association and the Washington Beverage Association, inherently, these are the issues that are on our table
Of course.
every day. And then what do you also start to realize when you start selling garbage bags is how much garbage is there. One of the clearest examples is when you think of a pallet, right? You get a pallet from the production facility. It arrives at your warehouse for distribution. You now cut off a layer of plastic to put it away, or if you're putting it away and splitting the pallet up, you now cutting plastic off, wrapping it again, and then whenever it goes out, it's being wrapped again with plastic. And so in many cases, you start to realize there's a path of plastic that we're just leaving behind that is not even calculated in the bottle process. And so I just started, because from a business perspective, waste became something of value for me to take note of, both politically and financially. You can't hide from it. I had this like urge to solve this problem because it kept on appearing at my desk.
I see. I see. And ultimately, even if we're business people, et cetera, we're also consumers and citizens, right? So we need to see whatever we're doing as being sustainable. And that's good business oftentimes, or almost always as well. I want to dig into a little bit more about your earlier parts of life. You grew up in what city?
So I grew up in Oakland for my first 12 years of my life. And then I moved to Mercer Island, which is, as a local of Seattle, it's a floating island in the middle of Seattle that seems to have almost the full privilege of Bellevue, but the access to Seattle.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's obviously a very nice neighborhood. Lots of well-to-do people live there. So you probably had a chance to go to a school system there. So you were, middle school when you moved here?
Yeah, I was in middle school and I went to Islander Middle School, and then I went to high school in Seattle at the Northwest School.
Got it. Got it. And the family's operations, like where the actual bottling and stuff was happening, where was that?
Our distribution facilities are in Central Washington, in Wenatchee, Omak, and Moses Lake. We have a co-op production facility down in Tumwater, which is just outside of Olympia. And so we have a model basically where we do co-op production. So basically, we realized back in the day that you can't have the efficiencies of a 400,000 square foot production facility in a 50,000 square foot warehouse, right? Like that just, so we started producing as a co-op and then we distribute. So it's a very hub and spoke system, which inherently starts to make you look at org structure and system design because of the fact that produced over there, delivered here, and then how do we route it to the stores in the most efficient way possible?
Got it. When did you get involved actively or working in the family business?
So when I was like 17 in high school, I did a summer working in the family business where I did all sorts of jobs from tailing service tax to merchandising to doing promotional activities at the Omax Stampede. From that point on, pretty regularly involved.
Your siblings, your family, is that typical? Was everybody kind of like jumping in their teenage years?
Yeah, so we all had to kind of go through a baptism by fire summer. So we all worked for the family business at one point. My sister Eileen and I were the ones who just kept on going back. And then in 2013, after having my animation video production company in New York, I came back to Seattle and then moved out actually to Wenatchee to work kind of full time in the family business. And that's
Got it.
that's where it's kind of, you got to be much more hands-on. Obviously, working on a business remotely gives you some insight. When you're on the ground, you have all the smells, the real touch points, the real stories, and the experience day to day. It's a very different environment. And that's kind of when I really opened my eyes to how everything works and runs.
Got it. Talking about, I guess, innovation, one of the things is that sometimes the startup innovators don't give enough credit to the legacy innovators, right? But it turns out most businesses are constantly innovating and reevaluating what they do because competition makes them, markets change, consumer behavior changes, supply chains change, right? A lot of external factors that are always changing and you're constantly innovating. But it sounds like in your case, the business has been around, the family business has been around for decades, and it's evolved and you've had to evolve it with the times to stay relevant. And then now you're further innovating in a way personally into a totally new business model, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that came up in one of my family's conversations, which is, especially when you have a business family, and then there's a slight possibility that the kids might go into the family business, but there's possibility they may not long term, right? And the parents feel very positively about the business because it served the family well and they feel that they're filling a need. And so when you are deciding to go to college and what to study, right? How did the practical aspects of where you might end up career-wise or in the business or starting a new business, et cetera, affect your studies or your choice of what you studied, or did it?
So it didn't. And I think originally when I went to college, I was kind of looking at two tracks. Wanted to do architecture, and then I also wanted to do international politics. So both things were kind of up my alley. I was not going to college to prepare myself to go back into the family business. I was going to college to explore the world, right?
I see.
When I was in the junior in high school, I studied abroad in Argentina for 6 months. And during that time, I witnessed the economic crisis of Argentina. So in 2001, when I got to Argentina in like Buenos Aires, the streets were packed. You had this road called Santa Fe, which was a main commercial thoroughfare, completely packed. Stores. By the time I left, about half of them were in foreclosure. So I was in this environment where I was like, is anybody else seeing this? I ended up kind of falling in love and feeling almost responsible to having to, like, it's stupid, but I felt like I was responsible to trying to help it. So when I studied international politics and Latin American studies, which is what I ended up graduating with, it was almost like, how can I heal this wound that I got to see open?
How has that exposure and kind of to Latin America, but also in college, studying kind of the softer fields, right, as opposed to like STEM or hardcore business or something like that, how has that influenced or helped you become a better business person?
I think with Latin American studies, and this is the same spiel that I did when I was doing interviews in Argentina after college. It was
Mhm.
basically, if I understand your culture, I have a better chance of understanding what you want and how to
Yep.
sell to you. And I think at the end of the day, kind of studying from a political background and understanding people's kind of environmental context gives you a better understanding of how to empathize with their needs and
Yep.
address their needs. So, was I studying at Hopkins to learn how to sell in Buenos Aires? Not really.
Right, right, right.
Did it in the back end happen? Yes. Right. Like, so you just end up realizing that you have a variety of inputs that come from college experiences that then you regurgitate as, oh, okay, I now know how to use this input for this output down the line.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Switching gears a little bit in terms of what Godot does. I mean, I love the name, by the way. I guess so. So this is it's like waiting for Superman. We've all been waiting for Godot, but there's no Godot, so we're going to solve it ourselves. So as you started the company, it's how many years old now?
We actually started as Bottler Distribution Group 7 years ago. But because I did a massive pivot to waste to energy, about March of 2023 was like when I made it official. I would say we're weirdly 7 or not even 2 years old.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And so give us the elevator version of what is Godot? What is the model?
Yeah. So the model is quite simple in weird ways. Is we're trying to find giant piles of waste that get produced every day. We're starting with organic, but down the line, we're going to go to municipal solid waste and other sources because there are just so many trash piles out there. When you look at the total waste streams out, 3% are kind of your consumer waste, and then 97% is industrial commercial waste. So we're starting with that 97% just because those piles are coming out every day. And those are the companies that currently have a specific need to address them. And in many cases, they just haven't. So we focus on these giant waste streams. And what we're going to do is we're converting those wastes into, we basically put the waste stream into a pressure cooker with hot water, blast it, and create this bio coal. It's called hydrochar. And we can then use it within coal technology so that we're not really changing a lot of the technology and putting tech risk and supply chain risk and talent risk in the process.
So you're basically taking the waste stream, converting it into a fuel that looks like an existing fuel that's already, so there's a process chain built for it already, and you're just like plunking it in there, right? The hydrochar material.
Exactly. So this way we can start to scale a lot faster. We can address the problems that exist today with existing technology. And more importantly, down the line is actually permitting. So as we were looking at like, what are the ways to get this stuff done? The bottlenecks almost are always permitting, supply chain, and people. And so by doing it this way, we're able to hit all three right on the head, and we can address as pilots as quickly as possible. The deficiency is capital, right? That's always, but it's a very simple, kind of resilient way to approach this.
This question I don't like getting, but I'll give it to you anyway. What's the moat, right? What's the differentiator? Another way to ask is, why has this not been already done?
Yeah. So I think there is multiple moats. I think one moat is I just inherently, through my experience and my network, know where the piles are and can go right to the decision maker of those piles.
Got it.
And that is not an insignificant moat, right? The other piece is we have kind of secured the rights to certain technology that allows us to convert it into the hydrochar and then from there build out a process.
Are there like some exclusive licenses or something like that?
Yeah, we do have an exclusive license in North America with our partners. Over time, there are pressure vessels. People know how to do this. This is well established in Europe and Asia. It just hasn't come to the United States. And a lot of the, I guess, trickiness is people are very myopic in what they're trying to solve. And many people are so project focused, they're not thinking about how does this scale? And if this works here, how can I copy and paste it? And for me, from the beginning and from my perspective of growing up in the Pepsi world, I always think about the copy and paste step because otherwise it's not worth your time. And so that's where I think a lot of the differentiator is. I started really early on focusing on how do I scale this? And then also, how do I bring in the right people around me to kind of support me? And that's also another mode is my network of advisors have dealt with these specific problems at the scale that I'm looking at, and they just haven't been communicating with these different parts of the supply chain.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So as you try to, you know, get this off the ground, oftentimes when people do capital intensive new initiatives, it's potentially a different pool of money that you need to tap into than when you do a software innovation company, as an example, right? Where you do have to hire engineers and product managers and so on, but you're not setting up big plants that cost tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So I'm curious how you've kind of navigated the pool of money scenarios, right? As far as how do you access those pools where this is clearly a capital intensive model. And there are a lot of people with a lot of money that they like to put to use in scenarios where it's like, okay, I want to get the biggest bang for my buck, right? So I don't want to do a capital intensive business, right? But there's certainly still pools of money where they're actually specifically chasing capital intensive business models, right? So I'm just wondering how you've navigated or what you've learned as you've tried to tap into resources from the investors.
I would not say I'm great at that right now. I think one of the bigger issues is identifying who is that group of people that want to address capital issues and understand the complexity of these big projects, right? And the opportunity. And many business models, especially when we've seen where capital been so cheap for so long, software seems like, with the zero interest rate, we'll put something in software and it'll scale infinitely big. But that's not realistic. And so where we've started to see is there's a large network of investors and capital allocators that are really interested in solving complicated problems and understanding that it doesn't necessarily fit the traditional financial risk models that most private equity businesses are looking for. Because we kind of joke that while we're looking from a venture perspective for raising capital, we're much more like a private equity approach, right? We're taking much lower risk by using established technology with established processes, et cetera. So you talk about a moat, and most people are like, well, your moat tends to be your walled garden. Well, I'm not going to run out of waste piles. So I don't really care about that moat. My moat is going to be speed and ability to get all the right people. And I need capital allocators who understand, yes, there's going to be a lot of upfront money, but down the line, they're going to get paid handsomely because, quite frankly, we're building the shovels for AI, right?
Got it. Sure.
When we're talking about our outputs, we're talking about hydrogen, we're talking about carbon credits, we're talking about even carbon ash for battery storage. So we're really trying to build all of those pieces to enable the AI infrastructure. And there's just so much money going into that right now. So we're not so worried about attracting the right pools. It's more about ignoring the people who want us to do asset light approaches because that's not going to solve built world experience.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, there's different profiles of money, right? There's money that's targeting certain opportunities. There's money that's targeting other opportunities. Operational businesses have always attracted money from private equity and other investors, even if you're not necessarily innovating a entirely new business model, or at least not a revolutionary one, as many software companies or tech innovators are working on, right? Which tend to potentially have higher risks and significant rewards if and when they're successful.
I'll push back on revolutionary org structures. I would actually say most startups are just copying and pasting a very feudal approach, right? Like if you think about an org structure, it's essentially king or queen. Then you have like a series of princes, lords, and stuff like that. It's very similar, right? We just call them CEO, SVPs, managers, right? And I think where we're going to actually innovate on the org structure is going to be very dramatic because as I scale, I realize I want to organize employees by skill sets and knowledge sets. and organize them using natural language processing so that we can basically program solutions with the right and appropriate human capital for each of those projects versus a traditional tree diagram of an org structure.
I see. I see. There are a few companies that have tried kind of different org structures, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Valve, which is a platform. They have a very different org structure, right? And the way they operate. And it seems, I think the goal is similar, which is how do you get the best experts working on the best problems, right? Independent of titles and hierarchy and all that, right? And then in that particular case, if I understand correctly, they're leveraging the transparency of the whole thing to say, oh, this person's really good at this. They need to do more of it. Maybe they deserve a promotion, but it's not a manager making those decisions.
Yeah. No, and I think Valve is a very interesting one. The biggest one is the kind of NVIDIA, because I think when Jensen Huang is able to have 60 direct reports, it's because he does the entire stage gate process before it gets to him. And so it really allows for a lot more flexibility and ability to move quicker. But the other piece is it saves people time, right? When you have more people working together on the front end, you have actually less communication overhead on the total project. And just think about like trying to improve something across 5 divisions and you have one step up for each one. So that's 1 times 5, it ends up being a minimum of 10 communications, and it goes for much longer than that. So I like to think of it as how do we reduce the total amount of communications where each communication creates a potential risk of failure. And the more that you have a bottleneck in that process, you create a vitocracy. And I'm trying to avoid that by building these kind of networks of people that are able to kind of collaborate together by what they're good at and not asking them to participate with what they're bad at.
Got it. Got it. Okay. In terms of what's happening, I guess at Godot, or the constraints or the opportunities that you're working on. So besides resources, what are the other things that you're looking at that would potentially help you grow by leaps and bounds in the next 6 months or several years?
Yeah, I think some of the bottlenecks is just participatory. Like we just need to connect big companies with other big companies, right? You're essentially right sizing the volume of output of waste streams to what those potential things of value can be, and then creating a distribution of all those outputs. So for example, in Wenatchee, we're going to produce hydrogen. That means we need to find some type of output for that hydrogen. I'm very fortunate where I get to have kind of 2 hats as a Pepsi bottler on one side. I can say, hey, look, my fleet is probably, for my large trucks, is probably going to go either full hydrogen down the line, or we'll do a step stage where we do a hydrogen diesel blend and then into hydrogen. And so therefore, now I have a fleet that will consume my hydrogen and decarbonize in the process, right? And we'll be able to kind of go to market that way. So I had to build that network of essentially hydrogen hungry people. And that's where it's sometimes difficult because you have a lot of chicken and egg situations. People don't want to build something for a future that they don't control. And where I'm trying to bring in is large players and, these fleet managers, companies like Penske or something like that. How can they help essentially build up the demand function for our outputs? And so that would be a risk factor that I'd see is if all of a sudden Trump says fueling by hydrogen is illegal, that's a risk, right?
Sure.
But right now, the biggest constraint is just capital. There are people who are investing in the region for different things that will require hydrogen, for example, sustainable aviation fuel. So we know, down the line, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, the demand for hydrogen in our local region will increase. And so I can build for that and not necessarily be 100% dependent on me being the consumer of my outputs.
How does it work if when you approach a prospective consumer of hydrogen potentially, like what is that cycle like? Are they just saying, okay, what's the product and what's the price? Or is there more to it?
There's more to it. First of all, the question is, where do you want to dispense and where do you want to sell it? So if we want to dispense locally, like our model right now is we're going to produce here and we're going to dispense within 1,000 feet of the production facility. So therefore, we don't need to do liquefaction. That creates a significant reduction of cost of goods. The question is, the reason why you do liquefaction is because of energy density and transporting it long distances. So my whole objective is really building out of a local ecosystem to consume it so that I don't have to ship hydrogen a long distance.
Got it.
I just want to have kind of a consistent production distribution. And that's where it's going to be easier. If we have to find people, we have to create offtake contracts. There is a lot more work that needs to be done on the front end. And you're also trying to get commitments for a future production of a facility that hasn't been built. It's a much harder value prop. And so that's where you need to have your partners really take leaps of faith. And in many cases, we've seen historically those leap of faith tend to pay out pretty handsomely.
Do you incentivize? So like your early adopters, how do you incentivize them? So it's like, how do you get the first people to jump into the pool, right? Because that's the hardest part. Because once people are like, oh, the water's great, I can swim great, everything, it's fun exercise, or I make money using hydrogen is good. It's good for my branding. It's good for the environment. It's good for economics. And then they already see few people do it or more than a few, then it's easier, right? But the first batch, do you have additional incentives, or how do you incentivize the first batch to say, okay, let's take this plunge?
Like I did do additional incentives. Some of them are as simple as saying, hey, let's see if we can agree to a flat price, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the people that are going to be willing to be early adopters are just the people that are going to be early adopters.
They're looking to innovate themselves, right?
They're looking to be innovative, and they're also willing to be patient, right? Like early adopters are patient because they understand that things don't come off perfectly every time.
Yep.
Late adopters assume that everything is going to be perfect. They're usually paying a premium for that, right? Early adopters are able to capture more of the market and then also have more of the learnings. We just have to find the right parties. There are some parties who on paper might make sense, but culturally are not early adopters. They're not worth the time.
A little bit about our crew, High Tech Advisors. We're a services firm, so we advise a lot of companies, and we also work on their tech and IT and talent initiatives. So we had a chance to work with a lot of early stage companies. We also work with established companies, but a couple of the business models where you do have, it's kind of an interesting mix. So there's the healthcare side is one business or domain. Another one, which I had an opportunity to work with slightly, was rockets, right? And so in both of these domains, there are projects that take a lot of capital. And so the industry or the domains, they themselves incentivize innovators by, like the government, like if you're a rocket company, the government wants you to be successful because they want more diversity in the supplier of rockets, right? Reliable, cost-effective transport to space. We never have enough of it. And the government's interested in like spawning more competition or more suppliers of that. So there are companies who can go to the government. And then it's the same thing with the other buyers of rocket services, whether it's an Amazon or a Facebook that's trying to put satellites up, or whoever's trying to do, I don't know if Amazon's trying to do it. But they all are like, okay, I need more suppliers. So when you go to them and say, hey, I'm building a rocket transport, are you interested in, buying some capacity? They will do letters of intent and all that stuff. They might even give you a couple of dollars. They're like, if I'm going to buy $100 million or $500 million worth of capacity from you, and if you give me 10, 20% discount, I might give you $1 million now. Right? Just your odds of success are higher, right? For a $500 million, or maybe even several billion dollars, $1 million or $3 million doesn't change anything for the negative if it doesn't work out for them. But the potential reward is significant if they can get one more supplier, help them increase capacity and inventory and so on. And there's similar stuff in the healthcare side sometimes where people are making these long-term big pharma bets, and NIH and CDC and FDA and DHS, all these entities are interested in actually having more successful solutions out there. So they'll actually do LOIs and they'll do grants and things. And this type of money, then the good thing is it's usually non-dilutive, right, for the startup. can make a significant difference. And it can also obviously make the investors a lot more comfortable, right? When you have X number of those and so on. But anyway, I'm not sure, if that's applicable or relevant to the domain we're talking about.
Obviously something we would love to see and explore. I think one of the difficulties that you have when you deal with essentially waste management or sustainability is people inherently look at it as a cost. Like, this is just another thing in addition to our daily operations that I have to deal with.
Sure, sure.
And so where we're really kind of flipping that narrative is saying, hey, look, if you're producing enough waste, let us come on site, rent land from you, and process it as quickly as possible so that that waste does not spend a lot of time on trucks, does not generate its own emissions as it's going from one place to the next before ending up in the landfill. And so we're really switching a lot of that kind of value prop of how people interpret sustainability and waste management. And I think that's where we might see a lot of participation coming in, because we're changing that value prop. But it's not the same as saying, hey, I'm going to send your thing, Project Kuiper, I'm going to send your satellites up for a 10% discount. But Blue Origin happens to have the same ownership as Amazon, right? Like, the way that a lot of those contracts are working are actually because while they are different companies, they tend to be the same humans. Even if it's like same investor pool, that is where a lot of those networks are kind of helping each other out because they see a bigger mission and bigger value prop. It's a lot more difficult when you're dealing with so many different stakeholders and where some stakeholders are just looking at this is a problem, solve my problem, versus this is an opportunity, give me access to this opportunity.
Exciting stuff. Yeah, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And then if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. That's one of the things some of the guests have wanted in the past. Startup life, business life, but startup life specifically is intense, right? In terms of number of hours and where you have to show up, where you have to pitch, whether it's investors or potential customers or suppliers and so on, right? I'm just curious how you don't lose control of health and mind and,
I'm probably not the best when it comes to working out or anything like that. I've been much better recently. It was unfortunately the day before my 40th birthday, I got hit head on. And so doing PT has kind of gotten me back in shape. But startup life is not healthy. You end up taking a lot of sleepless nights because there's 20 different things that you should have said in those 20 different meetings. You are trying to write emails at the end of the day after being essentially brain dead from 30,000 Zooms. Startup life is not easy. It's non-linear. And throughout the day, your emotional range can hit highs and lows like no other. So one of the things that I've realized has been super helpful is actually breathing exercises. I read a book called Breathe, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but it seems so stupid, but it was so simple. You just slow down your breathing, you just kind of do some mindfulness, and it's really helped kind of calm me down from the highs and lows of startup life. And I think the other piece is I enjoy learning new things. And so I'm always running on adrenaline. I'm always learning. I'm always curious. I'm always trying to prod and find different things to make it work. And because you're in a startup world, you're kind of not bound by traditional parameters, which allows you to really think outside the box versus if you're in an organization that's well established, it's all about wealth maintenance versus wealth growth. And so you're not as curious, you're not as creative. And so this is, for me, super energizing because I get to be as creative as possible. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, I just had to let go of ego and just pivot, right? And that's kind of what I did. This whole journey started by how do I make the beverage distribution system more resilient? I realized that you could sell more products on beverage trucks. So I was focused on putting more things to cube out an outbound route. One of the things you realize in the beverage world is you're limited by the weight of the vehicle. So the more that you can switch out a heavy item for a slightly less heavy item, the more you're cubing out your vehicle and the more you can make a profit per drop. What I didn't realize until my conversation with the oil exec was I was missing the fact that every Pepsi truck goes out full and comes back empty. And now I have an entire vehicle that I can use as a collection system. It's just that once I did my pilot and went across the street to ask, hey, do you have waste to add to my pile of waste that I'm going to collect on these trucks? Did I realize that there are people who are every day producing enough waste that is the critical mass for us to have real solutions on site or near site that address significant environmental issues. Just to give you kind of to grasp, because it's sometimes hard to understand the scale that we're talking about, but we are effectively going to remove about 1/6 of the vehicles in Wenatchee from a mission standpoint, just from this one account. Seeing those opportunities is super energizing. And
Right, right. I see. This is kind of the ideal scenario, right? So you're saying that startup life is demanding physically on your body. It's demanding on your mind, emotions, and everything. But, or the domain that you're working on itself is something that you're excited about, the creativity opportunity that you have in applying the creativity and solving challenges that face us. That in itself is energizing. So it doesn't feel as much of a chore as it could, right? If you were pushing something that you didn't find so exciting.
yeah,
So it becomes its own reward.
yeah, it's so energizing. Like, because you realize that you can actually affect change and address the problems that everybody points at, but doesn't do anything. And that's what's really exciting is like, I can clearly see a pathway for addressing climate change at scale around the world. It's just a matter of money, right? And if that's the problem, that's easily solvable, right? It's when you have these really complicated, technologically difficult systems, that is a whole nother deal, right? And I think some of the space race stuff is that, or fusion, for example, right? There are real technologically difficult problems to solve there. Turning waste into a biocoal and then using existing technology is not such a huge hurdle.
More execution and optimization problem, right?
Exactly.
You're not crossing some kind of a physical boundary.
Exactly. And you can then hire the right people. You can find the right tools. So for me, it's reduced my, let's say, my future execution risks, but it's also energizing because I can see how it's all going to play out. And I can also get other people like on my team to see the same vision very easily.
Makes sense. Wow. Wonderful. I personally like sustainability and scalability. How do we make ourselves scalable as society, as humans, without destroying the environment, but also make money in the process, right? We don't need to do things out of charity and out of just altruism.
Yeah. I also think that altruism and charity just don't go that far, right?
It's very hard to scale.
Well, it won't scale because just think about it every year when you get requested to donate something,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Some years you can donate more, other years you can't. Well, those organizations are dealing with the can'ts all at the same time and the cans at all the same time. So they think they're going to grow. It's too finicky. Versus if you're doing something that delivers value that somebody's willing to pay for, it will repeat until they're not willing to pay for it, right? What got you interested in sustainability? Did you have a single aha moment that kind of got you interested in sustainability in any way?
When my daughter was very interested in sustainability and climate issues from, when she was a kid. And so she actually volunteered at the Seattle Aquarium for like all the 4 years of high school and won some awards and all that. And she put a lot of time into it and she became an ocean advocate. And so that kind of like put that front and center, right? Even though might not have been thinking about it as much otherwise. But I think fundamentally, maybe it's empathy, right? I consider myself extremely fortunate and lucky to be in the socioeconomic and geographic and time and economic place that I am. And so how do you make that scalable? How do you help other humans have that, right? So, if you're generating significant amount of pollution, then all the people that have to live around that, whether it's plastic or liquid or whatever it is, they're not having the same kind of opportunities I'm having living in this relatively clean place. Empathy is one factor, I think. But I also fundamentally am like you. I think nobody does anything out of charity. Nobody does anything out of a good heart. I mean, it's not that we're all evil. We're mostly not evil. We're actually positive, and I think humans are mostly good or more good than evil. People just have practical lives. You got to put food on the table. You got to get your work, and you got to take your kids to school, and you got to pick up your cats and dogs from when you're traveling, all this stuff. So charity is very hard to scale. So I think you have to come up with creative business models that build sustainability and profitability and scalability. So if you get these three things lined up, then you have a winning formula. This has been fun. I appreciate the time, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a thing or two. Do you have a website or some way for people to get in touch if they're interested or curious about anything we've talked about?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I am pretty active there. Feel free to reach out if you're interested in learning more, helping, participating, investing, giving us piles of waste. Feel free to reach out. Very interested. Find me at andy@godotsolutions.com.
All right. Thank you, Andy. It's been
Thank
wonderful.
you.